welcome back to my channel, Beautiful Minutia. If you're new here, my name is Tiffany and welcome to day 8 of the 12 days of Christmas. We're kind of in the home stretch here. We're now in January. We're now, the last, third of the 12 days of Christmas. And since it's the new year, it's time to start sharing my stats and my favorites and all of those kinds of things from 2023, which are some of my favorite videos to film and just look back on all that stuff. So today I'm going to be sharing with you my top 12 books with some cheats because it's the 12 days of Christmas, so we're doing top 12 books, but I'm going to dive into some of my stats and what my reading looked like in 2023. So I'll have timestamps, so if you're only interested in the top books, you can skip over the stats, but if you're a stats nerd like me and you just think it's fun to look back on all of those things, keep watching. So in 2023, I completed 129 books, which is pretty good. I'm really excited about that. That was a higher total than I anticipated, which is facilitated by reading a lot of shorter books this year, which I'll get into in just a second. But I did end up DNFing 11 books this year. So with that, that brings my total to like 140 books for the year. But again, some of those are DNF'd. I used Storygraph to track all of my averages and everything this year. I was really, really good about updating on Storygraph, more so than Goodreads. So according to Storygraph, I read 41,561 pages, and they allow you to mark DNFs at the page number that you left off on. So I would say that that's a fairly accurate page count. Of course, some editions of books have more pages than others, especially with classics that I read this year. So that could still be off, but generally that's pretty accurate considering I can put in how many pages I read of a book before I DNF'd it. Out of the books that I read, only 4 of them were rereads. This was not a heavy reread year, apparently, which is fine. There are so many new books that sometimes I have a hard time convincing myself to reread books, even if I want to, because there are just so many new books I want to read. According to Storygraph, my mood overall was adventurous, reflective, and emotional. And as you can see in the pie chart, there are a lot more moods reflected there, but those are the 3 main ones. My genres are all over the place, but I don't think you'll be surprised to learn that I read 47 classics, and that constitutes the majority of genres that I read, but that was closely followed by fantasy. I read 31 sci-fi or fantasy books this year. So that's a pretty good chunk of the books that I read this year as well. I also read a lot of manga. I read 14 manga volumes this year, which would be Spy Family, Apothecary Diaries, Kuma 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 Bear, and Attack on Titan are the 4 manga series that I read this year. I didn't complete any of them, but they're all in the progress. And so I read quite a few manga volumes. And then for middle grade, I read 30 middle grade, but 10 of those were graphic novels, so they're even shorter than your average middle grade. So between manga and graphic novels, that's 24. So I think that that's the reason why my total is as high as it is. I only read 12 nonfiction this year, which is not quite 10%, and that's okay. I want to read more nonfiction, but sometimes that's just more difficult for me to get through. But according to Storygraph, my average page length for books that I read was 312 pages, and 63% of the books that I read had less than 300 pages in them. So again, I think that that's why I completed so many books this year. I had some really big chunky books that I read this year, but out of books that were over 500 pages long, that only constituted 12% of the books that I read this year. The longest book that I read this year is Oathbringer by Brandon Sanderson, which clocks in around 1,200 pages. And the shortest book that I read is actually a short story by Ray Bradbury called There Will Come Soft Rains, which I absolutely loved, by the way. But that was, I don't even know, I think like some places say like 30 pages, but I think that's if you're buying that individually and it comes with like study guides or something like that. I read it out of a collection of Ray Bradbury short stories, and I know it was less than 10 pages. I would say that was definitely my favorite short story that I read this year as well. I read some collections, I read some individual short stories and novellas, and There Will Come Soft Rains was by far my favorite short story. The book that took me the longest to finish, I think, is Middlemarch by George Eliot, and even though it was not the longest book that I read, it took me, I think, close to 3 months to finish it, like 2.5, 3 months to finish that one. Nicholas Nickleby was up there too, because that took me about 2 months. And then also Demons by Fyodor Dostoevsky took about 2 months. And so I have different books that took a length of time, but Middlemarch, I started on March 1st as kind of a March of the Mammoths book, and I didn't finish it until the end of May. I did try to diversify my reads a bit more this year, so I had around 20 translated books, and that's not counting mangas. So I tried to read books that were from other countries, translated from other languages, and I did try to read more outside my comfort zone. Probably the thing that I read that was the most outside my comfort zone was actually Attack on Titan, which is a manga series, and it's classified as horror, and horror is so not my genre. And I actually started this series thinking it was like action adventure, which there's a lot of action in it, but it definitely has some horror elements in it as well that I was kind of unprepared for, but it's horror that I'm okay with. And I'm actually really enjoying that series. I am 7 volumes into it. Okay, let's go ahead and dive into my top 12 with cheats. So the cheats here is that I have several books that are parts of series, and so I'm just putting the series there. So that way I don't have multiple books from the same series in my top 12. I just didn't want to do that. I think I have 3 series that are on here that all would have had multiple books that I would have had trouble placing. I will tell you if I have a favorite out of the series so far, I will tell you what that is. And then also there are 2 books that I read at the same time that don't seem like they should go together, but they did, and reading them at the same time enhanced that so much more and caused it to be higher up on my list. So those books are sharing a spot, and I'll tell you about that when we get to it. Okay, coming in at the number 12 spot is Stormlight Archive. So these are the 2 Stormlight Archive books that I finished this year, started and finished. Then I also read some novellas. I'm in the process of Rhythm of War at the time that the year is ending. And I've also read Warbreaker and some other Cosmere books, including Tress of the Emerald Sea, which actually makes Brandon Sanderson one of my highest authors that I read this year. I've read 7 Sanderson books this year, but then I've also read 7 volumes of Attack on Titan. So those are my 2 highest authors. But yes, Stormlight Archive. What do I even say about it? I love it. I think that the world building is so intricate, but these are books that, though they have fast-paced scenes in them and lots of twists and reveals and stuff, they took me a long time to read. They are longer in length, and I feel the length in them. Some people said, oh, I don't feel the length when I'm reading Stormlight Archive. I do. They take me a long time, a lot longer than the Mistborn books took me, and I'm okay with that because I think that Sanderson's world building is so masterful. Like, seriously, unbelievable, unparalleled. I don't think I've ever read anyone else who has such intricate world building where everything fits together and makes sense, and it's on such a massive scale. And this is just like a small part of the Cosmere, and this is massive. So I truly have loved these books. I have really enjoyed the character development. Dalinar is my favorite, and I know that for most people they like Kaladin more than they like Dalinar, but I just love Dalinar. And actually, so far my favorite book in the Stormlight Archive is Oathbringer. And maybe it's because we get so much of Dalinar's backstory and thought process and all that kind of stuff. And Dalinar's ending in this book is just like so deep and so like emotionally impactful. And I just love his growth in this. I love Kaladin's growth too, don't get me wrong. I love all the characters in this except maybe Shallan, but I really enjoy everyone in these books. Coming in at number 11 is a book that I did not rate 5 stars. There are actually a lot of books in my top 12 that were not 5 stars. By a lot, actually, I mean 3, but you know, that's a quarter of the books that are in my top 12 that made it that I gave 4 stars to at the time. And then as I've had more time away from them, I love them even more. And that is Oh Pioneers by Willa Cather. This is the first and still, unfortunately, only Cather that I have read. I have plans to read 2 more of her works in 2024. So I'm really looking forward to that. But I actually read this with my Patreon. I had been dying to read her works. I had accumulated like 4 or 5 of her books. And so I put up a poll, and this is the one that won, and we read Oh Pioneers together. And it is such an atmospheric story in the way that she describes nature and living on this harsh Nebraska prairie, and how farming is for these immigrants who came here with nothing and they're trying to make a life for themselves. And then there's a whole lot of drama that ends up happening that I did not anticipate. There are things about the ending that I just felt like were very out of character for the main character, and I just didn't like how some things were handled. They were handled in a way that just didn't make sense to me, and that is why it ended up being less than a 5-star for me, because I was thinking the whole way through like, oh my gosh, this is gonna be a 5-star book, this is gonna be a 5-star book, and then I'm like, oh my. So this is wonderful though. I really, really love it. Another book that I did not rate 5 stars, but I can't stop thinking about it. I can't stop thinking about just like the depth of the themes and messages that were communicated, the depth of conversation that I had with people that I either read this book with or had read this book and I talked to about it. Something Wicked This Way Comes by Ray Bradbury. And oh my goodness, this is actually my first Bradbury full-length novel, although it actually is pretty short. I think it's like 200 pages or something like that, but I had read his short stories and just loved them. And so I was pretty sure that I was gonna jive with him, but I was nervous going into this book because it's supposed to be spookier, and it actually ended up getting chosen for my in-person book club in October for a more spooky book. And oh my goodness, we had reactions all over the board. We had people who hated it, people who thought it was just okay, and then people like me who just absolutely loved it. I mean, some of the writing is kind of more over the top in a way that can be distracting at times, and I think that that is really the only reason why it didn't achieve like this perfect 5-star rating, but it's one that has stuck with me. I just love the exploration of growing up, the exploration of relationships between friends, between fathers and children, the fear of aging or the desire to age more, and the examination of love and goodness winning over evil. And I just, it's so good, and I loved it so much. Look at all these tabs. Incredible. Next up is another series, and the first book in this series was one that got chosen for a Patreon read that my daughter participated in because it was her birthday month, and that's the Melendi Family Quartet. I read both the Saturdays and the 4-Story Mistake with Claire this year, and this one I read with my Patreon. This one I also read with Christy Lewis from Dostoevsky in Space, and these books are the best. They are about 4 siblings who are growing up in New York City in this book, and then they move to like a different area in the country in the 4-Story Mistake. And it's about these siblings and just their relationship, their growing up. And I just think that Elizabeth Enright does the best job ever of capturing childhood and how children feel about growing up, how children feel about life, and how they process things. And like, it just brought me back to so much of my childhood, and I just absolutely have loved this. There's 2 more books in this series to go. I have book 3 locked and loaded, and I'm really looking forward to it because a lot of people say that that's their favorite one. And so I'm really looking forward to continuing on with this series, but I just absolutely loved it. If you're looking for something in your life that is just wholesome, heartwarming, has tons of humor, and is super well written with just like great descriptions and a strong sense of place, whether that be the city or whether it be the country, this is a series that you really have to pick up. I had so much middle grade this year that was just mediocre or downright bad, and so these books were just a breath of fresh air. Coming in at number 8 is, I think, my last series on this list. That's the Farseer trilogy by Robin Hobb. I read these 2 books start to finish in 2023. I read the first book, Assassin's Apprentice, in 2022 towards the end of the year, and loved that one. That one still might be my favorite of the series, although I really loved Royal Assassin book 2 as well. And Assassin's Quest I struggled with, but ended up just loving it and giving it 5 stars anyway because I think it came full circle and just did such a great job. This series is one of my favorite fantasy series of all time. I've only read the first trilogy, and this is in her greater world, the realm of the underlings or elderlings. I can't remember which one it is. I think it's elderlings. Anyway, so this is the first installment in that, and I just love Hobbs' writing so much. She just sucks me in a way that very few authors are able to do. And she builds a world that's really understandable to me. She creates characters who feel very flawed, very real, and yet I still feel very attached to them. And she packs an emotional punch that will make you sob, because I sobbed books 1 and 3. I actually didn't for book 2, even though there were moments that made me a little misty-eyed. Book 1 made me sob the hardest, if you know, you know. But book 3 definitely had some very gut-wrenching moments towards the end of that one. So I need more Hobb in my life. I think she's my favorite fantasy writer, but she's not higher on this list just because there are some other fantasies that are here, but they have impacted me in a deeper way. So that's why she's a little lower down here. But if we're just ranking like authors, she would be a lot higher than number 8. Number 7 is another fantasy, and this is one that I have not been able to stop thinking about. I read this in September, and that is Jonathan Strange, Mr. Norrell by Susanna Clarke. Oh my goodness. Just, oh my goodness. This book, it's such a chunk, and that is very off-putting to people because you do feel the length at times. This is more of a slow-moving book anyway. So I think that a lot of people who dislike this book think that it feels kind of bloated. And I don't think I necessarily agree. I think there were moments that I didn't love, but overall, this was a book that I read with someone else and had such deep discussions of spiritual truths in this. And it was just like, I don't know, like light bulbs going off when I finished this book of just the brilliance of her writing. And I'm so excited. In January, I'm reading Piranesi, which is her other work, which is much shorter and is much more tightly plotted and paced. So there are a lot of people who like Piranesi more than they liked Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell for that reason. But I thought that this was really fantastic, and it had a very good like Dickensian feel to it. And it's like a fantastical historical fiction, kind of almost like an alternate history in some ways, kind of a thing. So it felt really unique in that. And the fact that it felt so Dickensian is really what worked well for me, especially reading it in the fall. Next up is the first of 3 nonfictions that I have on this list. So out of the 12 nonfictions I read this year, 3 of them made them into my top 12. Actually, top 10, really. So that means I read some really high quality nonfiction this year. And so this one is Breaking Bread with the Dead by Alan Jacobs. I read this book in May and remembered thinking, oh my gosh, did I find my absolute number 1 favorite book of the year? This book is so incredible. And it's, as you can see, it is not my favorite, but it made it pretty high up in my top books of the year. And it's one that I still think about all the time. The whole book is about why you should read classics, how it connects us to the past and helps us kind of be stabilized in decision making for the future and have kind of like the bandwidth to deal with our life in the present that's throwing all kinds of things at us, and kind of learn to communicate with people who are different from us. You know, there's just like a lot of reasons that he gives for why reading classics is so important. And his conversation just really, really resonated with me. And I just found it very validating because he put things into words that I didn't know how to, that I was like, yes, that's exactly how I've always felt. Coming in at number 5 is my last cheat spot, and that I have 2 books sharing 1 spot, even though they are not part of a series. So this is like my major cheat, I think. And so these books, they don't seem like they go together, but if you've listened to like my quarterly favorites or just different wrap-ups where I talk about favorites of the year throughout the year or whatever, you've heard me talk about these books because I read them in June. So that would be Labyrinth by Borges, which is a classic, Argentinian classic translated work that has short stories and essays and parables that do a lot of idea exploration. Borges does not hand you what he's trying to say on a platter. This is not a book that you want to read if you want something light or interesting, like you're like, oh yeah, it's not like, oh my gosh, this is such a page turner. He explores ideas about time and morality and different things like that through his stories. And this is a book that is better read if you are able to discuss it with someone else and discuss the ideas, and that really enriches it. And I read this book with Dia from Novel Idea, in addition to also hosting a read-along of Knowledge of the Holy by A.W. Tozer. And these are not books that you would think would intersect. This is a spiritual nonfiction about the attributes of God. But there would be so many times where the story that I would read on that day would be like exploring time, and then the chapter in Knowledge of the Holy would be about how God relates to time, created time, is outside of time, and just his eternal nature and things like that. And so there would be so many times there'd be an idea explored here and then a concrete thing about God offered here. And it was just like so fascinating to pair the two of them together. It's not a pairing I would have ever come up with on my own, which just how the timing worked out. And I'm so happy that it did. I'm so happy that I read them both at the same time. I feel like I would universally recommend the Knowledge of the Holy to any Christian or person who wants to know more about God and how he reveals himself in nature and through scripture. Borges is something I would be a little bit more hesitant to recommend to just the average person, just because it requires a lot of brain work and adjustment to his writing style, but so worth it and so wonderful to read these two together. So oddly enough, my next two books, books 4 and books 3, were books that I finished really early in the year. This book I finished in February, and I did a dedicated review on it. So I'll link that so I don't go on and on and on about it. But I read with a group Demons by Fyodor Dostoevsky, and this could also have an alternate title of The Possessed based on which translation you end up reading. This book was amazing. This book was so different than other Dostoevskys that I read, because often you're dropped into a Dostoevsky with a million people and all the plot lines are kind of like converging. You zoom in as you go. I felt like this was zoomed in at the beginning and we slowly panned out. And there's so much in this that is like fascinating and like fast-paced and like political intrigue that I just wasn't expecting. And I also feel like Dostoevsky has a lot of philosophy in his novels, which is super common with Russian novels, but he tends to go on like really long tangents sometimes, and I felt like the philosophical meanderings were much more bite-sized in this, which was really interesting as well. I felt like they were much more digestible and kind of like made more sense in the conversation than some of the Dostoevskys that I've read, but this one is just so good. Spot number 3 is a book that I actually read in January, and I cannot stop thinking about it, and I love it so much. It's the only one that I don't own a physical copy of, though I do have a digital copy on my Kindle, and that book is Sword of Kaigen. This is a Japanese-inspired fantasy world that is so well built and so intricate, and the world building is so fascinating. The political dynamics were so interesting, and I absolutely loved the way that the author took some super difficult and touchy subjects and found ways to talk about them in such like a healing and redemptive way. Things about grief, things about loss, things about like marital strife and finding who you are as a person and being unable to accept or receive love or give love in the way that you think that you should. I mean, there's just so many ways and things that she explores, and the depth of her characterization was just insane, just so phenomenal to me. This book was not a 5-star book, and it made it into my top 3 of the year because I do think that the author kind of fumbled the ending a little bit. I felt like there were things that were not satisfactorily explained and were just kind of like, why did this happen? Oh, just because it did, was kind of like the answer you were given. And then there was like a point at the end where it kind of brought a character back and introduced some new plot threads that were not at all resolved. And at this time, the author was not yet planning to continue this into a series. It felt like she left it wide open for a series, but right now she's not intending to write anymore. And so I felt like the ending was a little bit off and it felt a bit pacey at times. So there were things about it that I'm like, this is not perfect 5-star. It's just not. But it's my favorite fantasy read of the year. It was incredible and it was so good, and I would read it again in a heartbeat. And like in hindsight, I'm like, oh, I kind of wish I had given it 5 stars because I have like 6 out of 5-star feelings about it. But I felt like there were some issues with it and I felt like I couldn't quite give it 5 stars. It was independently published, and I kind of wonder if this had been under a regular publishing house with an editor, if a lot of the issues I had with it would have probably been fixed. Book number 2 of the year is a classic. So this is my favorite classic of the year, and that is Agnes Grey by Anne Bronte. This is a book that was not on my radar for a book that would be a favorite of the year. I read this for Victober with my Patreon, and oh my goodness, did this little book just wow me with its writing, with its beauty, with the deep spiritual truth in it that just resonated so deeply with me, with a love story that I more than 100% got on board with and was so invested in, and just, oh my goodness, everything about it. I loved everything about it. And if you've seen my classics TBR for 2024, you know that I'm planning to read The Tenant of Wildfell Hall in November, and everyone has told me that they like The Tenant of Wildfell Hall better if they've read both. And I'm like, how does it get better than Agnes Grey? This is just a phenomenal book about a young lady who's a clergyman's daughter and their family falls on hard times, and she decides to become a governess to help support her family. And she ends up in some really difficult situations with some really poor families who are not treating her well. Poor as in like poor morally, not financially. Financially, none of them are poor, but they are just not good families, and they don't treat her well, and they don't have good morals. And the way that she stands her ground ethically while still being like respectful and polite and kind and loving to people around her, like Agnes Grey is a hero. I'm just saying. Okay, number 1 book of the year. This was for a read along that I hosted in November, and if you're part of that read along, you probably are already very well aware that this book was going to make it in the top 10, because I said like, oh, this is for sure top 3, might even be top 1. It's had a little bit of time to percolate. For sure, number 1 book of the year is Joy in Christ's Presence by Charles Spurgeon. There are not words for how this book impacted me spiritually, emotionally, and the experience of reading it with so many of you was just incredible. I had Dia and Chrissy as co-hosts, and we had a reading schedule and then hosted lives every week to talk about the chapters we read, and so many of you were there every single week, jumping in, sharing your thoughts, sharing the things that were so meaningful and impactful for you. And this book was healing for me in ways that I didn't know I needed to be healed, and just really built faith and trust in the Lord. And it's about so much more than just like being happy when you are experiencing the presence of God. Like there's so much more to that. Charles Spurgeon was known for being very depressed for a lot of his life. I'm sure that if he lived in today's time period, he would for sure have been diagnosed with clinical depression. And so the way that he writes about joy is very different than someone who has not experienced great sorrow, great loss, depression, struggling with feelings. You can tell that he has experienced all of those things and experienced Christ in all of those things. And so the depth and wisdom from which he speaks is so good. This was written in Victorian time period, and it feels like it was written now. Like, it's so accessible. It doesn't feel like the language is difficult or tough. It's so good. The way that Spurgeon can take a verse and just pull so much out of one verse just blows my mind. And I just loved it so much. If you have not read this book, as a Christian, I am begging every fellow Christian, read this book. It will probably change your life. It's so good, so meaningful. Oh, loved it so much. Well, that's it for this video for top books of the year and all my stats for 2023. Would love to hear from you in the comments down below. What were some of your favorite books that you read in 2023? I hope that overall you had a really good reading year. I definitely feel like a lot of my reading year was mediocre, but the books that were good were so dang good. So I'm really, really pleased about that. I'd also love to hear if you have any thoughts about the books that I've mentioned here today. I would love to chat with you about that, but especially excited to hear from each of you what some of your favorite books of the year were. Thank you so much for watching. If you like this video, please hit like and also subscribe so you can continue to see more bookish content from me and more of the 12 Days of Christmas. And I will see you again next time.